Most people want some moderate sense of economic freedom.
Right. People want it, and the hybrid legislature is the best to deliver it because they got the expertise to understand what the issues are, and they also got the feedback from the people, and so they're less, likely to be, interest groups tend to be less dominant maybe in those legislatures. So that's what we think is going on, and that's what our results have found.
Economic freedom leads to prosperity, but what leads to economic freedom? Although the academic case for private property, reasonable regulation, and the rule of law is highly persuasive, that is often not enough to inspire political reform. So why do some polities embrace economic freedom while others actively undermine it? Feler Bose is an economics professor at Indiana University East, and his research focuses on the 50 states and why some are freer than others. During our conversation, he also tossed in some interesting analysis about the relationship between prioritizing economic freedom and supporting or opposing other types of freedom, namely sexual liberty. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Welcome to the AIER Standard. I'm Ethan Yang. Right now, we're on the road at the Public Choice Conference in Seattle. As you can see, we're recording in a makeshift room, so we apologize for the setup. But I'm really happy today to be joined by Feler Bose, who's a professor of economics at Indiana University East. Feler, it's great to have you.
Thank you for having me, Ethan.
And so we ran into each other at the cocktail reception at the conference. You're not necessarily affiliated with AIER, but you did have a very interesting story. You told me that before you became an economics professor, you were actually an engineer. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so my background is pretty varied. In my undergrad, I got a degree in chemistry and physics, so more for pure science. Then I went into graduate school at Georgia Tech and got my master's in mechanical engineering. I worked a few years, but was a little uneasy about it. I wasn't sure I wanted to do this for the rest of my life. And I took in my undergrad. I took my undergrad at Hope College, which is a liberal arts college, and there I took one economics class because they said you got to take, you got to get a broad education, right? And that was, I took one econ class. I thought it was pretty easy, and I thought, who would want to study economics? But a lot of the ideas, that I learned in the class kind of stuck with me, and made me think maybe there's a future in economics, and I wanted to see if there was, and so I attended some seminars at different places, trying to learn more about economics. I read some books, and at some point, I decided to see if I can get a graduate degree in education, which is when I went and studied my PhD at George Mason.
And so George Mason, you're joining us here at the Public Choice Conference. I'm assuming your approach to economics is more on the classical liberal side, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's more, the George Mason tradition, Austrian public choice, the classical liberal perspective, yes.
And were you always like that, or is this more of a learning experience?
I grew up in a socialist country, so you could say I didn't know any better, but I knew that my parents are well connected, so they did okay. But the rest of the people did not do well. I noticed that if you had a government job, you did okay. In India under socialism, but everybody else struggled. So I think at some point I realized, and I came to the United States, I was like, well, you don't need to be working in the government to do well. So I think those are things that kind of open me up to alternative approaches to how economic systems should be run. And so yeah.
And I guess a little bit for the audience, you mentioned, because I know India had, much like China, went through a series of economic reforms.
Right. So India in the year I left to come to the United States, they started major changes in their economic policies, major liberalizations that opened up the market. They had some smaller changes beforehand, but in '91 they were kind of in a hard place. And so they did some dramatic changes, and that changed the country quite a bit.
So I guess they're just waiting for you to leave then.
Yeah, just needed me to leave before they could implement things.
But that does bring us to the research you're presenting at this conference, which is essentially what leads to economic freedom. So I was wondering if you can give us first like a little bit of a taste of what's in your paper.
Right. So, economic freedom. There are people that have measured economic freedom across the world, different countries get a ranking and so on, like based on, how good are the property rights, how good are, the legal system fair, the monetary system stable, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of studies that have been done at the national, international level, cross-country. But there's also a bunch of studies that are being done at the U.S. level, because in the U.S. we've got 50 states, and so each state is a little different when it comes to government policy on taxes, on labor markets, what sort of regulations occur in labor markets, taxation policy, and spending policy. And so they got, there's also a group that has measured economic freedom in the United States. And so what I wanted to understand is, what are the factors that might play a role in, how much economic freedom there is in the U.S. states. Most of the work has studied economic freedom as an independent variable, whereas I wanted to look at economic freedom as a dependent variable. And there's only maybe a dozen studies that do that.
And so you're saying that the vast majority of studies just look at how economic freedom, benefits states, but you're actually trying to look for, okay, fine, we can all agree that economic freedom is good. So how do we even get there?
Right. More focused on what is driving economic freedom. Yeah. What are the factors that impact that cause where we might see more economic freedom and where we might see less. Yeah.
And you said that the study focuses primarily on the 50 states, or is it more international?
No, it is only the U.S. 50 states.
So I'm from the People's Republic of California. So I was wondering if you can maybe, what did you find out about the various states? So why is California one way, Florida another way?
Right. So, like I said, there's about a dozen studies that have already tried to understand these things. And some of the unique thing that we have brought, my co-authors and I have brought to the study, is whether the type of legislature that you have in the U.S. matters in terms of, economic freedom. The United States is kind of unique. You got 50 states with all doing different things. Some states meet, like California, for example, you mentioned, is a full-time legislature. Okay, so they meet all year round. People that are in the legislature are professionals. That's the only job. But there are some legislatures where they are meeting maybe every other year, and they may only meet 2 months out of the year. Okay, and I'm saying, so they're meeting 1 or 2 months in the year, or they may meet every other year.
Part-time legislatures.
They're part-time legislatures. All of them have other jobs, because there's no way that income that they earn from being a part-time legislature is going to support them for 1 or 2 years. So they're really just there as as a service, and they may think of it as a service. Kind of the people's legislature, you could say. And so you have this variety where you have full-time legislatures versus just barely part-time. You know what I'm saying? But you also have this what's called a hybrid legislature, which is kind of in between. They may spend 50, 60, 70% of the time in doing legislative work, but they may also have a side business that they do, and they go back home and do that. So they get more of their income. Maybe the majority of the income comes from legislative work, but they also get a large chunk of income from other work.
And so what you're going with that, I'm assuming if you have a full-time legislature like California, you have a lot of people who are essentially maybe putting a little bit more thought, maybe more ambitious. The incentives are essentially that they need to be making laws to be in business, essentially.
Right. So if you are a legislature, right, I mean, if you think about it, legislatures want to, they want to get reelected, right? I mean, that's kind of the basic assumption. Legislatures, tend to be, they want to get reelected. And so if you're a full-time, now, one way to get reelected is if the way we thought about it is if there's no information costs, right? You can get information for free, so to speak. Then you know what all your voters want, right? You know what the majority of the voters want in your district, because you know the information, right? There's no cost to get that information, and you can always vote for policies that are majoritarian. Okay, and if you always vote for policies that are majoritarian, then you always win re-election. Okay, now, unfortunately, information is not free. All right, there is a cost to getting information. Okay, and therefore, right. So how do you know what your voters want? Right, if you're a full-time legislature, you're sitting in the capital city, right?
You have a lot of aides, people.
You got your aides, everything, but you're sitting there, but you don't really know what people want, right? You're kind of isolated in many ways. So how do you know what people want? Well, interest groups play a role now, right? So interest groups, maybe the NRA, right? AARP, right? They might come and lobby you and say, hey, look, the people in your constituency support, people should be able to wear firearms, right? As a defense or whatever, or hunting or whatever the issue is. And then, the AARP may come and say, hey, look, the people in your legislature want to make sure that, they retire in your community, that they don't want to get taxed in their retirement incomes and so on. So, but right, interest groups are focused on right, they're trying to suggest that if you do what they think is the right thing to do, you'll get reelected. And they'll, help you get reelected because they'll give you donations and so on. But they really focused on interest groups, right? They're only focused on their minority constituencies, right? Not the majority. But the idea is hopefully, right, and you can listen to them because that's, you're getting information from them, but not from the general voter that's, kind of that, was it ignorant, rationally ignorant, right? So they might, so you end up, doing things that the interest groups want, which are not necessarily in the best interest of the population, okay? And so that might restrict economic freedom, right? Because they're not necessarily doing for the common good, but for their own special interests, okay? And then you have the other extreme, where you got part-time legislatures, right? They're in the community. They're meeting people at churches. They're meeting people at the grocery stores. You know what I'm saying? They're getting all the information about what people want. But the problem is they're only meeting, 1 month out of the year or 2 months out of every 2 years. You know what I'm saying? Something like that. And so they have a disadvantage because they have all this information, but they don't have time. Okay, they're kind of time restricted, time constrained. And so their goal is to pass the basic legislation as quickly as possible and get out, right? They've got 1 month or 60 days or whatever. They got to do all the work. And so they're kind of in a rush to get things done and get home. And so they also need interest groups because they want to outsource some of the legislative stuff. Okay, they don't have specialization. They don't know anything about all these issues that are important. And so so a lot of interest groups, for example, help write model legislation. Okay, and they say, hey, this is a model legislation you should pass if you want to, for example, restrict abortion or something like that, right? Or, what I'm saying? Or you want to, so the legislator doesn't even have to do any research in the topic. He just says, oh, this is great. I support, pro-life causes. Okay, I'm going to look at this model legislation that says, this is what we need to do to, restrict access, and then, say to abortion, for example, and then they will just pass that legislation. Does it make sense? So they're also dependent on interest groups, but for a different reason. Okay, that is, they don't have the expertise on legislation. They don't have time to do proper investigation into legislation, or what I'm saying. So they kind of outsource that part. Okay, which can also, right, which is focused on interest groups, which again could restrict economic freedom.
So when you have either full-time or completely part-time legislature, there's just too many incentives to, I guess, if you're full-time, you got a lot of lobbyists bothering you, and they probably want regulations, or they probably want some sort of special program that will benefit them at the expense of others. And also, I guess, if you have full-time staff and if you're there full-time, you're constantly thinking of what's the next problem, right? I want to, constantly just make more and more laws. Is essentially why you're paid. And assuming the other extreme would be the part-time legislature, where you might just get these fully completed laws. You don't really read it, and it's like, all right, well, that looks good.
Looks good, and I support you guys, so I'm going to just pass this law. You know what I'm saying? So you have this this hybrid legislator is what we are theorizing is kind of this optimal legislature, right? Because they are partly in the community, so they're hearing what people believe, and they also have the expertise to legislate because they're somewhat in the legislature at least 60, maybe 6-7 months out of the year. You know what I'm saying? So they have time to develop expertise and kind of follow, study the issues by themselves or with the help of their staff and so on. And so they're more, we think, more in tune with what the majority prefers, and maybe not so much what the interest groups want. And hence, so they'd be more, supportive of economic freedom issues. Because I think at least in the United States, people prefer being left alone, right? As opposed to wanting someone to raise their taxes and, kind of interfering in their businesses and so on. I think people don't like that. So voter preferences in that way are geared towards economic freedom. And I think the hybrid legislature tends to be more in tune with that than either the part-time or the full-time.
So I guess what you're saying is that a huge causal variable of economic freedom, not necessarily absolute economic freedom, because I'm assuming some people maybe don't want that, but generally speaking, most people want some level of economic freedom, and the better ability those people have to voice that concern to the legislature, the more chances that you can actually have policies that enact that sort of, like moderate amounts of moderate economic freedom. Obviously, we're not arguing that, everyone wants anarchy tomorrow, but but generally speaking, you're saying that most people want some moderate sense of economic freedom.
Right. People want it, and the hybrid legislature is the best to deliver it because they got the expertise to understand what the issues are, and they also got the feedback from the people, and so they're less likely to be, interest groups tend to be less dominant maybe in those legislatures. So that's what we think is going on, and that's what our results have found. So that
And I guess maybe this wasn't in your research, but perhaps an international perspective. You talked about India. I do a lot of research on China. Both these countries passed economic reforms. I would argue mostly in response to the old system, which is clearly not working.
Right.
And so perhaps you can argue that China and India, the legislatures were quite insulated, as China especially is an authoritarian system. And so I guess the causal factor was just the problems and the desire for economic freedom becoming so catastrophically apparent.
Right.
And that's sort of just mirrored in a way at a more moderate sense in the legislature, as in people can just voice that more easily. Right.
Right. I think in those countries, there's an abbreviation SHTF. I don't know if you heard
Shit
that.
hit the fan. Yeah.
I wasn't going to say it, but yeah, basically you basically are back at the wall, and in a sense, those legislatures, those governments or whatever had to do those actions. Right? They have really no choice. They may not have wanted to do it. I know in India there was a lot of resistance to it, but they really didn't have a choice. They're running out of gold to pay for things. You know what I'm saying? And so they really had to open up. They were forced in they're cornered. They had to make the decision. And so, but now the Indian government has slowed down all the reforms because they're not in that position anymore. You know what I'm saying? So we still need more, but it's not going to it's not happening because it's there's too many things that are holding them back.
And similar story in China after Mao dies in 1978. One, the economy is in absolute shambles, and then people are already a lot of Chinese people were already engaging in private enterprise on their own because the government was so weak, because Mao just weakened it so much after the Cultural Revolution. And essentially the new government sat down and saw the writing on the wall and says, if we don't enact these reforms, the people are going to rise up and enact them on their own. But I guess the major theme is, one way or another, the government just needs to hear it from moderate, normal people that they want not necessarily complete economic freedom, but a decent amount where they can make a living and live a nice life.
Right.
So on that note, and I guess you mentioned India, how they're slowing down because the desire isn't there anymore. I think similar thing going on in China where, Xi Jinping, economic growth has taken off, and that's not necessarily the main issue anymore. There's other issues, political considerations, and so the economic reform has also taken a back seat. So a very interesting development. You mentioned another thing during this conference, which is, economic freedom, right? We discussed the variables that lead to it. You also talked about variables that are sort of interrelated to it, more cultural preferences that either complement or contradict economic freedom. You mentioned specifically, you actually posed a very interesting question. I guess I'll give you the chance to pose it right now.
Yeah, right. So another aspect of my research, I didn't present it here, but I presented it before, is the idea of sexual freedom, right? What I mean by sexual freedom is, right, so my research has looked at the laws at the 50 states again, over a period of from 1960, I kind of tracked this, is, what is the score, how does a state score on sexual freedom? So, for example, what are the laws on the state on adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, divorce, abortion, fornication, cohabitation, prostitution, right? So there's like about 15 different variables. I look at what does the law say about those things, right? And so the way I've defined it is minimum sexual freedom is sex is only legal between a man and a woman in a marriage setting. Okay, that's minimum sexual freedom. And common law in the United States in the past, if you look at it, the focus was on protecting that law. That definition was protected, right? I mean, so everything else was criminalized, right? You had sex outside of marriage; it was just wrong, right? You had homosexual sex, that was wrong. You know what I'm saying? So you divorced, it was very hard to get a divorce. You know what I'm saying? So all the laws basically protected that arrangement where you can only have sexual relationship in a marriage and kind of, keep that marriage as whole, right? You don't want to break it, so to speak. So since 1960, my research has since 1960 tracked how the U.S. states are kind of liberalized from there. Okay, and so a lot of economists believe that freedom is good, right? People will say that economic freedom is good, like we just said. They'll say political freedom is good, right? Some people say democracy and representative systems are good, and so on. And the question is, well, many people also believe sexual freedom, right? It's kind of a personal thing, right, for many people. What's wrong with that being, why should we only limit sexual relationships only to marriage, right? Why not before marriage? Why not, I'm saying outside of marriage or whatever? So, so I was trying to think, so is economic freedom and sexual freedom, are they complements? Do they go together? Is that freedom just go together, or is it substitutes, right? That is, you gain one, but you lose the other, so to speak, right? It's kind of what I was trying to, that was another research project I'm working on. And trying to understand, of course, many people will say, well, there's no relationship between the two, right? It's just coincidental, So yeah, so that's kind of the argument that people are, people have an intuition behind it, they have biases around it, but nobody really has done that work. The last major work that was done on this topic was in the 1930s.
So when you say there's some sort of relationship, what is that relationship that you're observing?
Right. So, here's the thing with economic freedom, right? Economic freedom, if you have a stable government, right, stable monetary system, for example, stable legal system, like a fair system, secure property rights, right? What I'm saying is all those things help you plan for the future. Okay, they make you future-oriented. Okay, you start a business, can you pass that business on to your child or the grandchildren, right? So that's long term. Now you're thinking cross generations. Okay, if inflation is low or declining, whatever, it's just very stable. You know what I'm saying? You can plan your business plans 5 years into the future, right? Today we have banks that are suffering because all of a sudden inflation is much higher and they didn't plan for that, right? So you know what I'm saying? So those are things, and so a lot of banks will fail and so on. So I think low inflation allows you to plan for the future, so on and so forth, right? So the idea of economic freedom, it allows for the planning for the future, as opposed to immediate gratification. Okay, whereas sexual freedom, if I commit adultery, right? If I want adultery to be legal, right? What am I doing, right? I want immediate gratification, not concerned about the future, right? Because my wife will divorce me, right? Or I'll get sued. Half my income is going to go now, it's split. My kids are going to be messed up. Their dad messed, adultery, and so they're going to want to, and then their relation. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of creates all sorts of, effects, beyond your happiness. You know what I'm saying? And even like the controversial issues with let me see, relationships that don't cause children. Okay, but there's no children involved, right? So. Right, two men getting married, okay, you can say, well, that's no big deal, but you can't have children, right? So children, in a sense, allows for, thinking beyond your generation, right? Beyond your lifetime, so to speak. My argument is sexual freedom is, if a society is giving more emphasis to sexual freedom, the median voter or the voters tend to be more focused, more in line with high time preferences. Does that make sense? If the society is more eager to do more economic freedom, they're more likely to have lower time preferences, which is they're more future-oriented voters. So in a state like we notice, like if you look at all the states in the U.S., right? Usually some states have more economic freedom, and they usually have less sexual freedom, and some states have more sexual freedom, right, but less economic freedom, right? And so we'll see that. And so I think the causal story is this time preference story, okay, that if the voters tend to be more geared towards future orientation, right, then politicians still they want to get reelected again, they'll tend to focus more on economic freedom issues and sexual freedom issues, and then vice versa, right? If the voters are more geared towards higher time preferences, that they're more, gratification now, right, then they'll tend to be more sexual freedom than economic freedom. Now, of course, there are interest groups there also, right? If you have strong interest groups that believe strongly about we need to allow for, today the current trend in sexual revolution is transgender issues, right? I mean, there are some people that strongly believe that issue. I mean, could they override the wishes of the median voter? Yes. Okay. Now, of course, I think there's also a strong reaction against it, so that there may be a long time before this thing gets resolved in favor of one or the other. But I think the median voter, the time preference argument, I think has some validity. That's kind of a very Austrian economic approach. The time preferences are important in society.
And I'm assuming those time preferences are influenced a lot by political culture, since oftentimes sexual freedom is associated with more of a left-leaning cause, economic freedom that's more of a conservative cause. And I'm sure conservatives are always thinking about how do we conserve what we have so we can pass it on to the future, and progressives are more about how do we empower the people that we have right now, right? And so there's maybe sort of like also a political culture argument behind it.
I mean, there's certainly there's probably some interactive effects here going on. I'm saying things are interacting with each other, the institutions and so on. Yeah, I can see where that could be a possibility. Yeah. Yeah, I've actually done some of this. I looked at the OECD countries. I looked beyond the U.S. I actually looked at political parties across 22 OECD countries to see what they believe on sexual freedom and economic freedom. And the trend lines it's pretty straightforward. I said the left parties tend to be more focused on sexual freedom. The right parties tend to be focusing more on economic freedom. And that's what I find. In nearly every country that I studied, when I look at party platforms, the right tends to be driven by economic freedom, more economic freedom in their party platforms than the left, which is more sexual freedom. And I think it's, like I said, driven by time preferences. That was my hypothesis going into writing that paper. And so I think ultimately this research, since it's relatively new, at some point you have to think about it from an individual level, right? How does an individual act? Right, how an individual acts, and let's say they are living with someone before they get married, so to speak, right? So they have a higher time preference, or they hookup culture or something like that. They're kind of involved in that. That's a high time preference, right? Immediate satisfaction, no long-term commitments. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of the life you're living. What's your perspective on long-term thinking then, right? Is it you know what I'm saying? So that's something I would like to study at some time in the future to see, are they short-term thinkers or long-term thinkers, and so on, right? I mean, I think that's kind of, and if you can talk to millionaires, right? Are they long-term thinkers or are they short-term thinkers, right? So, I'm saying those are the kind of things I think that will be interesting to kind of, build off that project.
And I guess on the millionaire point, because I think if you mention millionaires, many people might conjure up an image of sort of like a playboy kind of guy, like he's got millions of dollars, but he's also got multiple wives, right? So do you think that sort of complicates, or perhaps maybe there's some sort of other consideration that's at play? Right.
So this kind of ties in with, right? Unwin, even Adam Smith actually brought this up, but Unwin was the guy. I said 1930s was the last time this was studied seriously. He basically studied 80 different people groups and like a dozen civilizations around the world over thousands of years. Basically, he said that societies that restrict sex to only monogamy, right, monogamous sex, so to speak, right, within marriage, they tend to be flourishing. They tend to expand. They tend to grow. They tend to expand. You know what I'm saying? They tend to be explorers and expand their boundaries, and what I'm saying, they got prosperous and so on. But the problem is, once they got prosperous, they started saying, well, what's wrong with, let's have fun also sexually, right? Let's not worry about monogamy. Let's make it okay to do other things, right, sexually. So, and then that, he says, starts to decline, basically, right? So basically, so it seems like there's, economic freedom from a societal perspective brings prosperity, but at some point when they get prosperous, people tend to be like, what's wrong with, having fun on the personal level, right? In terms of why should we restrict sex to only marriage and monogamy and so on? Let's liberalize all these sexual rules. And then they do that, then they start declining. And he says basically it's like a 2 to 3 generations. They increase, then they kind of liberalize, and they start declining. So there may be a temporary equilibrium where economic freedom and sexual freedom is high. Okay, but that really starts to decline, is what he's found. And I think maybe this playboy thing, right? People get very wealthy, and it's kind of Adam Smith. He even says, right? Yeah, at some point the rich can afford to, you know what I'm saying, have multiple girlfriends or whatever, get many women pregnant, right? And they can pay all sorts of payments to everybody. And so I think, I forget. I think Adam Smith talks about the loose society and the kind of the strict society also, where he says, yeah, the rich can kind of afford to do that kind of stuff, but if the society as a whole does that, then it starts the declining of the society. So.
So getting richer doesn't necessarily, all it does is allows your time preferences to be more accommodative because you have more money, you can afford to do more stuff. So
right, but then at that point it starts to decline, right? That's what Unwin found, and I think that's what will happen. If society. I mean things like fertility and so on has gone down. I mean, I don't want to. This is all these are a lot of complicating factors here, so I don't want to make any generalizations. But you know what I'm saying? So I think people have less children. I mean, there's people say there's also a reason, but I think there's also maybe a time preference thing. People not having children, things like that. Yeah.
So this has certainly been a fascinating conversation, and I'd like to end by asking you, what's next? Right, you're definitely drawing all these fascinating conclusions. What's your next area of research?
That's so. I mean, like I said, my research is focused on two different areas. One is this legislature, right? Is there an optimal legislature that allows for better outcomes, so to speak? Here, economic freedom is what we see, but I've also done some work on sunset legislation and some other work on other restrictions on the. So I've done some other work trying to understand, is there an optimal legislature? Looking at sunset legislation is legislation that expires with time, right? You want to pass like after 9/11, right? You pass legislation that restricts people's freedom, but then you sunset it, right? Because you're not sure what's going to happen, and you don't want people may support a temporary restriction on their rights, but then at some point it's easier to pass a law that says you're going to expire than trying to pass a law that's permanently in place. Does that make sense? So we looked at something along sunset legislation. So basically. Yeah, so we are focusing on, whether this optimal legislature theory, what I'm saying, is there some optimal legislature, okay, for things that are relevant and important to us? And then the other side is the sexual freedom kind of theory that I'm also working on. But that one is something I want to do at the individual level. So right now I've done it at the state level, but there are lots of complicating, confounding factors. So I want to actually, at some point, hopefully, look at it from an individual perspective.
Well, definitely looking forward to see what you find. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.